Hello and welcome to all the men and women of the West. I'm Joe, here with me is my co-host Dan.
Hello and greetings.
Today we continue the Hyborian Age Podcast, taking a break from analyzing a character because the thing is, Gorm's story will have to be told, but it'll be told next time. For now, we need to go back to looking at a broader scale of things as events kind of overtake Gorm's own personal tale. Namely, the trouble is that his initial invasions do end up getting held back by the Bastonians, the Border Kingdom, which holds them and even supplies enough troops to hold back the Hyrcanians. The trouble begins with Aquilonia. Aquilonia ends up adding Zamora to their empire, and then they decide they want more. They're rich, and as Howard put it, untold wealth had been rolled in by conquest. For this reason, the kings begin to wear more and more silk and gold and less armor, and they grow more and more detached from the reality of what's going on and the reality of life, their subjects. This is something that often happens in history, where you've got the initial leaders or founders of a country or dynasty who are very practical, very competent men, but then down through the generations, the society becomes watered down, or the dynasty becomes watered down, and you have them just slowly become less and less engaged with reality itself.
And then you have the entire matter of court politics with different advisors and nobles wanting different things, whispering different ideas in the ruler's head.
And he starts just going nuts. Which this has happened in Roman, Chinese, Byzantine history. It's happened even to an extent in modern history. The thing with Aquilonia, though, is that they'd exact tribute and more levies from the regions they conquered, such as Argos, Zingara, Ophir, Zamora, and the Shemite countries, which they treated as subjugated provinces. This was especially galling to the proud Zingarans, who would rebel several times. Now, Koth was practically reduced to a tributary state against the Hyrcanians. Numidia, fortunately for it, had never been really subdued. They ended up remaining fairly free and defiant. Good for them, though they were humiliated and reduced in influence since their initial alliance had been broken by the Hyrcanians. The trouble for Aquilonia is they'd push so far that almost even the Sumerians were their subject. They'd push as far east as they could. They'd push as far south as the Nilus, where they defeated a Stygian army and just slaughtered it almost en masse. And the king of Stygia was made to send tribute. This is probably the height of the Aquilonian Empire to an extent. Bithynia was reduced shortly thereafter and subjugated, and thus Aquilonia decides to set off on the mission to subdue Numidia, their longtime rival. The trouble for Aquilonia is they're relying more and more on mercenaries by this time. This ties in with the lack of real-world contact the emperors have, because they're relying more and more on Bastonian mercenaries and less on Aquilonian troops, as well as mercenaries and levies from the different conquered provinces. This is a disaster because those different regions want their independence and their freedom. And you have Aquilonia, which is just getting more and more degenerated by this time. When they go to push into Numidia, the Bastonians just have had enough. They just see it as, what is the point? We should be fighting out in the west. The Picts are a major problem. How about we deal with them first? And this leads to a serious desertion, which results in turn in Aquilonia hiring more Shemite mercenaries and deciding, you know what, enough with Bastion. So they invite them over to a banquet in the Bastonian lands. They basically come over and say, how about we talk? Modern fantasy fans are probably more familiar with George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones Red Wedding. Well, that was nothing compared to this. This is the OG fantasy Red Wedding. This is essentially a peace party. It's supposed to be a diplomatic mission between two allied states. The trouble is Aquilonia breaks all rules of war, breaks all forms and rules of logic, and just slaughters all the chieftains and royal families of the Bastonians in a great conclave. All this in the guise of having changed their minds, because the Aquilonians also arrived saying, you know what, you were right, we have to deal with the Picts first. Gorm must fall before we move east. But then they, pull out the swords just as the Bastonians are drunk and partying, and they invited the Shemite soldiers, and they also slaughtered a great many unsuspecting villages. When they march back, they leave what is called a ruined and devastated land behind them, which is very true. Then Gorm unleashes his full army and conquers all of Bastonia And the trouble is, Aquilonia is then surrounded between the Picts and the Hyrcanians, as they were warned by the Basonians. What's more is the Zingarans rebel yet again. This is followed by advance into Aquilonia by the Nemedians, who decide now's the time. You've got Corinthia and the Shemites, which rebel. Yeah, the Shemites, who helped slaughter the Basonians, decide, you know what? Okay, we'll take our freedom back, please. You've got the Hyrcanians, which thrust forward, and in two large factions. You have the further eastern Hyrcanians that come in, sweeping in from the north, devastating everything, including, to an extent, Nemedia, but we'll get to them in a minute, all the way into Samaria, only for them to get slaughtered in turn, because the Sumerians were never really conquered and just repelled them. They're too barbarous, and they use guerrilla tactics and slaughter both the Picts and the Hyrcanians that tread into their lands. You've got the Turanians, who've been struggling against Aquilonia for all these many, many years, possibly centuries, finally push into Aquilonia. And you've got, for example, the kingdoms of Shem that end up conquering Koth. Then they're defeated by Stygia. Stygia, though, ends up kind of repelling the northern invaders, only for the Black Kingdoms to start invading and conquering and annexing them, because they had to push back the north. Oops. As for the Zingarans, many of them would flee from the borders, because the problem is the Picts break into their borders, slaughtering a great deal of Argos. As for Aquilonia, the only region that remains free is Gunderland, the northernmost province. Do have a king, but I can't help but think it's probably a very decentralized kingdom. It's just termed a separate kingdom in the hills, and it survives the empire. So my earlier prediction about how maybe they should just go independent if they could, comes true. The Pictish Empire, though, and I use the term empire very loosely, it's not a real empire. It's just a bunch of conquered, blood-soaked regions. It includes Argos, Ophir, the western part of Koth, and westernmost lands of Shem. The opposite of this kingdom is the rest. Essentially, Hyperborea, the southern and eastern lands of Shem, Zamora, Bithynia, the border kingdom, Corinthia, most of Koth, and all the eastern lands of Shem are included in the Hyrcanian Empire. So, from Stygia in the south, or at least the Nihilus, all the way up to Vanaheim, you've got a Pictish Empire. But you have two big empires, quote-unquote empires, which are just simply growling at each other. But they don't have any kind of sophisticated civilization. What helps Nemedia out is the fact that Eastern Hyrcanians and the Turanians probably fall to some infighting, because they're actually separate factions. Now, there is a branch of the Turanians that move their capital. They move it into Zamora. Now, a portion of the Stygian army ends up overrunning a portion of the Black Kingdom of the Amazons. Yeah, but in turn, later, the Stygians end up being forced back. What do you think of this chapter of sorts in the history of the Hyborian Age?
It's fascinating how part of me was observing this, and with both the Picts and the other Canyons growling at each other, in a way I found there are aspects of civilization that Arus came to him that Gorm maybe should have listened, so that way his empire could last a lot longer, it could thrive a lot more. That's kind of what is going on with all these nations trying to out-barbarian each other and try to take over each other, growling at each other.
He did listen to all the correct lessons. The trouble is he does not have the bureaucracy of Aquilonia. He does not have the ability to transport food from one location to another in an organized way quite like what the Aquilonians had. He's more like Attila the Hun. He's just coming in, ravaging and breaking everything with no real conception of...
to build after conquering.
Yeah, now Attila had some ability for building, but for the most part he relied on the Romans to do the building for him. He relied on Roman officials, semi-Roman assimilated barbarian figures to do this kind of building for him. In turn, this is a marked contrast to, say, Genghis Khan, who always did have very good organizational thinking. In turn, the Hyrcanians don't seem to have been too interested in leaving anything intact either. Both have access to the same military technology and strategies that Aquilonia did. They both claim that. And the trouble is they're trying to use that against each other. So they're not fighting like traditional barbarians, a very sophisticated set of military societies, but they have nothing else of civilization in them. You got people on the ground level who are Hyborian and whatnot, who know how to operate a lot of things more than their conquerors. But their conquerors are not listening to them because you're the conquered people, you listen to me. But the thing is, they don't have the imagination, I think, hey, like the Aquilonian aqueduct, I can get that working. And if I do that, my people will have a longer lifespan. They will be cleaner. And thus, if they're cleaner and they're more well fed and the food they eat is not simply, raw meat, I can then go on to conquer more and have a larger army. They're not thinking like that. They're just thinking, I take my Waka guys, I go fight their Waka guys, we conquer, and we try to take over everything we've got. Much as the Picts have a lot of lands, from Zingara all the way up to Vanaheim, they do not have the Gunderland region. They do not have Samaria. They have a sliver of territory that no one can take. They also have the Basonian Marches, part of Argos. But the thing is, if you look at the map, almost everything is owned by the Hyrcanians, with one major hole being Nemedia in all their conquered lands. Nemedia is holding strong. I wonder if they have border walls and really, really strong, reinforced border regions, or if maybe they've got a lot of mountains and rivers so that they can kind of use natural defenses. I suspect it's more mountains than rivers. There's not too many that are reaching Nemedia. That said, I do think they probably built a few walls, because at that time, walls were very, very useful with keeping invading armies out. Nemedia has got a lot of advantages to an extent. It has no right surviving like it does. It has no right to, because it's right plop in the middle of conquered Hyrcanian regions, but they hold off the Hyrcanians. The Hyrcanians have conquered everything else but them. Now, we do need to regard this as a Hyrcanian victory, because they managed to push the Picts back to their original region, back into their box, although most of that happens after Gorm dies. But Gorm tries to conquer Vanaheim. Now, he's right on their border. He doesn't quite manage to take them. But next time, we're going to have to deal with Gorm himself.
He's going to be a fascinating character.
We'll be doing a discussion of the history of Gorm, where his life went, and how he meets his untimely end in the Frozen North. So, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to smash that like and that subscribe button, like you're Gorm smashing one of his enemies to pieces.